It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Martina Nguyen. Professor Nguyen is an associate professor of history at Baruch College, City University of New York. She received her PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and she's also a graduate of Northwestern University, where she earned a BA in history and political science. An historian of modern Southeast Asia, her research focuses on colonialism, intellectual life, and social and political reform in 20th century Vietnam. Her first book, On Our Own Strength, the Self-Reliant Literary Group and Cosmopolitan Nationalism in Late Colonial Vietnam, was published in January by the University of Hawaii Press and received the first book award from the Columbia University's Weatherhead East Asian Studies Institute. If you haven't read it yet, a fantastic book is available online for free on the UW-Madison's library website. And she's now currently working on a second book on the Bank of Indochina, which explores economic and political history of the Bank of Indochina during the transitional period of revolution, decolonization to early nation statehood. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Martina Nguyen.
Thank you so much, Agath. How do I go back to sharing my screen? Do I have to do that again?
Yes, just click share screen again.
Oh, okay. Oh, there we go. Can everybody see it?
Looks good.
Okay, great. Okay. Well, many thanks to Marie Agath for the warm welcome and for the introduction. I met Marie Agath a couple of years ago in London, and I'm really happy to see that she's thriving at UW-Madison in a fantastic institution for Southeast Asian studies. And I'm looking forward to reading her dissertation on photography. Before I begin, I also wanted to thank Professor Mary McCoy for the invitation to share my work with you today. And many thanks to Lisi for organizing this event. As Mary mentioned earlier, I'm going to be speaking today about my newly released book. It just came out in January, titled On Our Own Strength, the Self-Reliant Literary Group and Cosmopolitan Nationalism in Late Colonial Vietnam. And it was published by University of Hawaii Press as part of the Columbia University Weatherhead Institute of East Asian Studies book series. So what I want to do today, before I begin, is just, what I want to do is sort of outline kind of the contours of the book, but then actually focus on one aspect of the book itself, focusing on humor and colonial urban life. The scene in Hanoi's Old Quarter on the morning of September 22nd, 1932 was nothing out of the ordinary. Food vendors dished out steaming bowls of noodles to customers along the sidewalk, while rickshaw drivers pulled elegantly dressed patrons in the street. Shop owners watched the goings-on while waiting for the first customer of the day. Wandering peddlers carried their heavily laden yokes while dodging pedestrians on the street. It basically looked like every other morning in the 36 streets. Children roamed the streets selling newspapers, their arms full of newsprint fresh from the press. Only today, they were hawking something completely new and different. Buy it here. A new change in the world of journalism. Buy it here, buy it here. Phang Hoa or mores, buy it here. They cried as they walked. A Vietnamese reader who was curious to see what this new change was, paid 7 sous for the newspaper. He or she settled with a cup of coffee at a sidewalk cafe and perused their new purchase. If we were to glance over the shoulder of this Vietnamese reader, what would we see? Scanning the broadsheet format of the newspaper, we would be immediately drawn to the first and only picture on the page. And here is the picture here. What we see is a dilapidated bus full of people and belongings, people hanging out of the windows, even sitting on the roof and the splash guards. Basically, the title of this cartoon above says, it deadpans strictly 25 seats. For many, it's a scene that even today you would recognize in Hanoi today. Underneath the humor of this cartoon, you can see that it lays a pointed commentary about Vietnamese business culture. You could see there's a blatant disregard of health and safety. The bus is jam-packed full of people, definitely more than 25 people jam-packed on this bus. You could see the bare and patched wheels. And you could see that Vietnamese are physically unused to traveling in a moving vehicle, right? As illustrated by the vomiting passengers. The cartoon illustrates, it criticizes the slapdash profit motivated lack of specialization, anything goes business habits of many Vietnamese entrepreneurs at the time. And so you could see that beneath this very first cartoon, it hinted that there's below this humor lay a kind of reformist aim, more generally a kind of social corrective. The cartoon of the dilapidated bus was the first cartoon published in the newspaper Phong Hoa, or Vietnamese for mores. It was, to the best of my knowledge, the first time that a humorous cartoon even appeared on the front page of a newspaper. When Phong Hoa was launched in September of 1932, it became the first journal of its kind in Vietnamese publishing history. It was a journal completely dedicated to satire and to humor. Humor was no longer banished to the margins of newspapers as a means of filling up space left over from serious treatises. Instead, it was actually integrated into the paper's entire ethos as a defining characteristic and part of its whole raison d'etre. So here we have a kind of typical issue of Mores, the newspaper. This newspaper and the intellectual group that produced it are the subject of my first book. I explore the historical landscape of the 1930s in French Indochina. And this was actually a really crucial and formative decade of Vietnamese history, because it was the years when Vietnamese intellectuals forged political relationships and constructed identities that will define the revolution to come. The Self-Reliant Literary Group, or in Vietnamese, the Lực Văn Đoàn, were arguably the most important group of intellectuals in interwar Vietnam. They were the publishers of Mores, as well as its successor publication of These Days, or Ngày Nay. And they were the vanguard of a new youthful generation of Vietnamese intellectuals born in the decade that straddled the turn of the century. And this generation is unique because it was the first to be educated only in French and vernacular Vietnamese, and completely cut off and unfamiliar with the classical Chinese worldview of their predecessors. At the heart of my book is the question about the relationship between the intelligentsia and colonialism. I address the following questions in my research, or the questions that drove my research are, how did Vietnamese intellectuals make sense of the sweeping forces of modern life brought by French colonialism? How did they understand, internalize, and appropriate the foreign ideas and worldviews transmitted by their colonizers? And ultimately, how did they localize and use this imported knowledge to construct their own vision of a modern Vietnamese national identity? And as I realized that there's a number of grad students who are here who are probably designing their own dissertation projects, I want to step back for a second and talk a little bit about how I came to this topic in the first place. Thinking back, you know how you always put your life into some kind of like narrative, right? That explains how you got from point A to point B. Well, the narrative that got me to the Self-Reliant Literary Group is, I guess, a kind of long process of fate and destiny, punctuated by a number of events. The first event actually was really young in my childhood, where my father, who passed away in April of 2018, one of my most vivid memories of him was of him reciting a poem, a really a pretty incredible poem about a majestic tiger sauntering in the jungle, right? I mean, those of you who know it, it's, "Thế lữ nhớ rừng," right? The line beginning, "Ta bước chân lên dõng dạc đường hoàng, lượn tấm thân như sóng cuộn nhịp nhàng," right? Like it's this incredible, beautiful cadence that actually remained with me for a long time. And it was only as an adult reading Vietnamese literature that I realized that that poem was written by one of the members of the Self-Reliant Literary Group. So that was the first kind of episode of my life involving the group. The second one was right after college, when I was in the process of figuring out what I wanted to do with my life. And so I moved to Ho Chi Minh City just to kind of find myself. And I took Vietnamese classes at the local university. And I had a professor there who loved Vietnamese literature, and we talked a lot about Vietnamese writers, and it was there where he talked about the Self-Reliant Literary Group, and he said, yeah, those guys are bourgeois romanticists. They are very romantic. They were of this kind of middle class intelligentsia during the colonial period. So when you read their work, it's very romantic. Okay, so I filed that in the back of my head and just remembered that. I went to graduate school. I decided I wanted to go to graduate school. And the first summer after graduate school, I got some money from Berkeley to go to France to do some exploration about what I wanted to do for a dissertation topic. And I spent the summer at the Bibliothèque Nationale reading colonial newspapers and just seeing what's out there. And the thing that I loved reading the most was a newspaper called Phong Hoa that featured a country bumpkin in the city, which we're going to talk about later, named Litoet. And that was the most riveting thing I had read in the library that summer. And for those of you who are thinking about dissertation topics, it's probably a good thing if you actually really just enjoy reading the sources that you choose. So that there was that. And then, of course, the sort of last and third episode of my, timeline here is when I was in seminar at Berkeley reading about the political career of Nhật Linh Nguyễn Tường Tam, who is actually the leader of the Self-Reliant Literary Group. And the descriptions for me, I was taken aback, because on the one hand, I understand that he's a romantic writer, but then reading about his political career, less than 10 years later, Nhật Linh Nguyễn Tường Tam is going to become the leader of the Vietnamese Nationalist Party, as well as the first Minister of Foreign Affairs of an independent Vietnam. So Vietnam's first independent Minister of Foreign Affairs under Ho Chi Minh's revolutionary government. So for me, there was this kind of disconnect between, romanticism. Like how do you go from being a romantic writer to being a kind of political, like a diehard political actor in less than 10 years? That didn't sit right with me. And so I decided to delve further. When I did more reading into it, I found that the Vietnamese historiography about the group and Nhật Linh only speaks about them as writers. hardly, very little mention of the group's politics, very little mention of the group's reform. They are literary writers. Any discussion or analysis has been basically about their short stories, novels, their literary contributions. And even in kind of later scholarship, when they started, when the historiography starts to talk about their politics, it's always framed as reactionary or collaborationist. So that raised more questions. And that's when I decided that I wanted to choose to work on the group as my dissertation topic. And what did I find? I've been researching the group now for about kind of 10, 12 years. It's taken up about a quarter of my life. And what did I find? I found that the Self-Reliant Literary Group was more than a literary group. They were an intellectual and a political, and dare I say it, revolutionary movement. So this is what basically my book argues. It's a excuse me. In my book, I argue that the Self-Reliant Literary Group, through their far-reaching political and social reforms, they developed a discernible cosmopolitanism. That is a staunch belief in universal liberal values and a commitment to intercultural dialogue, through which it fashioned a particular modern vision of Vietnamese nationalism. So basically what the group did in its literary, as well as their entire oeuvre, their literary and social political reforms, they basically re-examined all aspects of everyday Vietnamese life, right? Cultural life, political, social life, and localized global intellectual currents and practices to replace what it considered as outmoded Vietnamese traditions. And basically, what was unique about the group is that at that point, they believed that Vietnam was not yet ready for political autonomy. And so what they did was to devise a strategic plan, a kind of conceptual framework or ideology for Vietnamese to build a civil society, right? Train and to create proto-citizens so that these various important institutions are in place by the time Vietnam is ready for autonomy. And so this allows Vietnamese to kind of basically build a nation without without being at the whim of the colonial government, for example. It allows them to kind of navigate these structures of power and domination, as well as the kind of uncertain global political terrain at the time. And actually what this created was a really curious case study, right? A curious and often misunderstood vision of Vietnamese nationalism that did not actively call for the overthrow of French colonialism. And because, the group set up this kind of framework, as you will, or a strategic plan or prescriptive plan, this cosmopolitan worldview was, for many critics, quite contradictory in ways, right? It embraced, a lot of different things that seemed to be at odds. For example, it embraced capitalism and bourgeois consumerism. It developed a taste for literary and aesthetic modernism, a faith in scientific and technological progress, a commitment to the mastery of human nature through the manipulation of space and objects, and an enthusiasm for nationalism and a really kind of complex opposition to extremist ideological politics. So, for critics at the time, and especially for the Communist Party, this was pastiche, right? This is, amateurish. But that said, what my book does is actually lays out the internal logic of this belief system, because this belief system comes from a really deep and profound understanding of not only the Vietnamese context under French colonialism, but also it was born out of this larger kind of understanding of global intellectual global intellectual thought as well as politics. So, so before I continue, just to kind of lay out a roadmap of what I want to do today, what I want to do first is to give a little bit of a background about the Self-Reliant Literary Group and context that would help frame the talk in which comes afterwards, which is I'm going to then kind of focus in on one aspect of my book, focusing on the topic of humor as a modern sensibility. And then at the very end, I want to discuss the significance of my work and how it contributes to our understanding of Vietnam, the field of Southeast Asia, as well as studies of European colonialism and imperialism. So before I launch into my discussion of humor, I just want to very quickly give a little bit of context to frame my book and today's presentation. France completed its pacification of Indochina around the turn of the 20th century. And over the next 30 years, from 1900 to 1930, Vietnam underwent a period of rapid modernization that really disrupted and transformed the country's economy, politics, and society. But just to kind of focus, I want to focus on two particular developments that is of relevance for today's discussion. The first development was the metastasizing growth of Vietnamese cities from 1900 to 1930. Hanoi, in particular, was transformed from an ancient city, a tiny ancient city, to the glittering capital of a unified, administratively unified French Indochina. Within a few decades, the colonial government demolished the ancient citadel, built government and civic complexes, overhauled the city's sanitation, public works infrastructure, and laid thousands of kilometers of railroads and telegraph lines that actually converged upon Hanoi. Modern technology such as electric lights, the sewage systems, automobiles, trams, and cinemas permanently transformed the way the city looked. The introduction of a market economy based on wage labor, the rule of law, and impersonal commercial exchange eroded the primacy of the village and traditional social networks. And as a result of these changes, Hanoi experienced drastic growth, right? The population ballooned between 1900 and 1931. So by the time the 1930s comes around and the Self-Reliant Literary Group make their appearance in 1932, Hanoi was literally bursting at the seams. In 3 decades, the population of Hanoi almost tripled from about 50,000 at the beginning of the 20th century to about 150,000 in 1936. So, I know, but I live in New York City, so 50,000 is not that much, but to kind of triple one's the population of a city is an enormous growth, and lots and lots of changes happening all at once. So it's against this backdrop, right, of this kind of metastasizing urbanization that we begin to see the emergence of cultural forms that reflect and appeal to this new, disparate, and diverse audience of the city, right? So the Self-Reliant Literary Group, their literary contributions, as well as their contributions to pop culture and things like that reflects the fragmented urban audience of Hanoi at the time. The second transformation I want to talk about is educational reform and mass literacy. This greatly influenced not only the development of the Self-Reliant Literary Group, but also its reading public as well. World War I and the demands of the First World War on France and its colonies basically necessitated the training of Vietnamese as local bureaucrats, right? So you know, with all efforts going to the war in Europe, you know, it left the colonial administration quite threadbare, and so there was a realization that France needed to, number one, train Vietnamese to kind of occupy the lower rungs of colonial administration, as well as an understanding that there needs to be some kind of reform so as to, I guess, ameliorate any kind of resistance or rebellion against the colonial governments. So what France did was basically transform the educational system in Vietnam at the time. In 1918, basically they ended the Chinese language Mandarinate examinations, right? The Confucian exam system that ended, and French authorities set up the University of Hanoi, right? So we could see here's an old photo of the new University of Hanoi. And this was part of the government's new Franco-Vietnamese education system. And it advanced actually a modern curriculum. So basically teaching of French language. It extensively taught Quốc ngữ, which is the Romanized Vietnamese script. It included general science, hygiene, geography, and French history. And basically what happened was within a generation, it transformed what it meant to be the intelligentsia. Chinese, classical Chinese, ceased being the language of intellectual exchange. Instead, in a generation, it was replaced by French and Quốc ngữ in particular. Quốc ngữ is the Romanized script, massive tool for mass literacy. And so what this created was a kind of linguistic disconnect between the Confucian literati intelligentsia that came before and the urban, Western intelligentsia that came afterwards. So the Self-Reliant Literary Group was emblematic of this first generation to emerge from this Franco-Vietnamese education system. So who were the members of the Self-Reliant Literary Group? They were an urbane group of intellectuals that ran the most influential commercial publishing venture in Tonkin, North Vietnam, during the 1930s. And just a little bit about who they are. The person up here on the top left, this is Nhiet Linh. That's his pen name, but his real name was Nguyen Tuong Tam. And he was the leader of the group. He basically founded Mores. He assembled the group of writers and called them the Self-Reliant Literary Group. He's also the character that the political figure that I talked about before, who in less than 10 years would later go on to be Vietnam's first Minister of Foreign Affairs as an independent country. So, Nhiet Linh, he basically had an illustrious political career after his journalistic career. Interesting thing about him, he will later on, as I mentioned, he will later on go to help revive the Vietnamese Nationalist Party, which was the largest non-communist nationalist party in Vietnam. As I mentioned a couple of times before, he served as Ho Chi Minh's Revolutionary Coalition Government Minister of Foreign Affairs. And actually, him and his party will actually be seen as one of the more viable rivals to Ho Chi Minh and the Communist Party. Because of this, he, in the late 1940s, was outmaneuvered by Ho and the communists, and he fled, and after that was branded a traitor and a counter-revolutionary. And he was joined in the publishing ventures by his two brothers, right? So the Self-Reliant Literary Group in many ways was a family affair. His two brothers, Nguyen Tường Lân and Nguyen Tường Long, right? They were best known by their pseudonyms as well, Thạch Lam and Hoàng Đạo. These two characters, they will become essayists and novelists. And he was also joined by his good friend, Trần Khánh Dư, who is best known by his pseudonym Khai Hưng, who he's going to be actually the most famous and prolific novelist of the group. They were joined by three poets. So three poets, they're down here at the bottom row. Hồ Trọng Hiếu is known as Tu Mỡ, who was famous in that decade for writing satirical poetry. Thế Lữ Nguyễn Thư Lễ was one of the pioneers of Vietnamese theater, as well as one of the pioneers of the detective novel and science fiction, so genre fiction in Vietnam. He also, quite famously, was one of the pioneers of the new poetry movement, which is basically rejecting of Chinese kind of Tang eight-legged poetry kind of strict formula and moving towards a kind of free verse. And this is a product of, being raised in a environment in which you read Verlaine and Baudelaire as opposed to Tang eight-legged poetry. And of course, finally, to round it out, Xuân Diệu or Ngô Xuân Diệu was one of the most famous romantic poets of the 1930s. So this is the Self-Reliant Literary Group, and this is their story is quite fascinating because the history of the group after the 1930s reads as some kind of like family drama, in which a family is torn asunder. In the revolutionary period, this top row, right, the guys who wrote prose and essays and novels and short stories, they end up following nationalist politics. They were non-communist nationalists, and all of the poets ended up following the Communist Party. So basically, comrades in art will become sworn political enemies. And the fates of these two groups also varied as well. The top row, everyone died at an early, they died early. Some of them executed by the communists, some of them by, some of them died naturally, but all of them died before old age. The poets, on the other hand, lived to old age and were given accolades by the Communist Party as nghệ sĩ nhân dân, right? Artists of the people. And so they all lived to old age. So it's a fascinating story about how this group became split in the revolutionary period. But it is in particular this fall from political grace, especially by Nhật and the other writers, that actually it colored the historiography of the group. So the historiography of the group has been pretty much distorted by the politics of the post-revolutionary period. So as I said before, the group were branded bourgeois romantics. They were branded counter-revolutionaries. Their political careers for decades were not spoken about or written about. And even today in the communist historiography, there's a tendency to just talk about their literary writings as opposed to their political reform or politics. Okay, so now we know a little bit about the group, about the context to which the group emerged. I want to talk a little bit about the sources that I used in my book. The two most important primary sources that I used were the group's newspapers, Mores and These Days, which spanned the years of 1932 to about 1940. In addition, I look at other colonial newspapers of the time, right? Because the group often got into vitriolic pen wars and debates over all sorts of intellectual topics, like women's issues, like, you know, the nature of plagiarism, the nature of pornography, the nature of, yeah, all different debates happening at the time. So I also looked at the rival colonial newspapers at the time. I also used archival documents from 3 different archives in Vietnam, and then there's 2 in France as well that I've accessed. And then finally, I was lucky enough to be able to make contact with and interview family members of the group living in France, the US, and in Vietnam. Excuse me. So while my larger project, right, my book looks at topics such as fashion, public housing, literature, women's issues, for example, what I want to do for the rest of my time today is to focus on one aspect of it. I want to focus on humor, which actually is the main foundation of the group's journalistic activities and the mode of transmission for their social reform message. I argue that actually the humor of mores and these days did not merely serve as an instrument towards social reform. Instead, it involved an entirely new way of being and seeing. In other words, a sensibility that was thoroughly modern. So a little bit about the nature of mores' humor. The way that the group laid out their humor was that, you know, laughter is not just a simple act. It's wrapped up in the drama of the human condition. Laughter was not just about, you know, letting off steam, or, you know, not just because it was pleasurable or recreational. Instead, it carried great potential as a social corrective. The paper, you know, the newspaper used irony and humor throughout the entire issue, not just, you know, it wasn't contained in a joke, you know, section, or like in many other newspapers. It was dispersed throughout the newspaper. And so basically what this does is that it forces the reader to read everything with a kind of sense of skepticism, right? Because, you know, the seriousness and humor was slippery. And, you know, irony, you know, you don't know when they were being serious or when the editors were being truthful or humorous. So there was a kind of a slippage in meaning here that requires the reader to be much more on their toes. And so, you know, you have to read everything with a sense of skepticism. And the skepticism, you know, when you combine that with ideas such as, you know, a suspicion of authority, a doubt of absolutes, this defines a kind of modern sensibility. For the first time, Vietnamese readers are no longer passive students to the authority of pedantic newspaper writers, right? They you know, up until this point, you had lots of newspapers talking at their audiences. Instead, what mores did was invited their readers to become active readers as well as active contributors to the discourse in the newspaper. So in short, the newspaper invited its readers to a kind of intellectual independence. The humor was it was dispersed through the newspapers through a number of ways, but the largest and most prominent trope of Mores' humor is this visual and textual character, right? This like cartoon of a country bumpkin by the name of Litoet. And Litoet, the name is a humorous name. It means a village mayor with swollen, infected eyes. And so you can see that there's a kind of you know, he's a kind of traditionalist looking figure. You know, he wears a turban and the robes of a Confucian literati. He always carries with him an umbrella, and he also you often see him hanging his shoes, right, from his umbrella, because he doesn't want to wear out his shoes. So he hangs them from his umbrella. And this character actually was not just a cartoon character. He is ubiquitous throughout the newspaper. He appeared in short stories, articles, poems, advertisements, essays. He appeared throughout the newspaper. And he was kind of indicative of Fenghua's overarching ethos of humor. And of course, this character becomes the cultural icon of the decade. Like even today, older generations of Vietnamese still refer to country bumpkins as Litoet or as Sase, his sidekick Sase. So this really was a kind of cultural icon of the decade. So what I want to do in the next kind of few slides is to show you a few cartoons featuring Litoet. And what was fascinating about these cartoons is that these were not drawn by the Self-Reliant Literary Group. These were contributed by readers throughout Indochina at the time. So readers would send in their own drawings of Litoet. So he became this kind of self-sustaining discourse in himself. So here, I'm going to show a few, throw up a few cartoons. This first cartoon is, here we see Litoet in a shop where he's buying a brand new umbrella. And he tells the shopkeeper, ma'am, please wrap my umbrella up really carefully. It's raining so hard outside, I don't want to get it wet. And so it sort of shows you the tension between, he wants to own this modern object, right? Umbrella it's something that was brought over by, France, and, he wants to buy and own this modern object, but he actually doesn't want it to suffer the wear and tear of everyday use. So, a lot of these cartoons feature Litoet, the country bumpkin, engaging with modernity of various types, right? Modern objects, modern culture, modern practices, and mores. So here's actually the first cartoon that ever appeared of this character, and this was from 1933. Here, Litoet goes to the city. Of course, he's, almost all of his engagements with colonial modernity takes place in the city. So he goes to the city and he sees a water fountain and is wondering whose funeral tombstone that was so strange. So again, not really understanding modern, urban infrastructure, right? Especially for kind of water and plumbing. The next picture, the next cartoon is on the flip side of the sewage, water and sewage spectrum. Here he is in the city again, and he's looking down a sewage manhole, and he says to himself, he holds his nose and says to himself, you know what, people say that Hanoi is civilized. My village, the well in my village, as dirty as it is still cleaner than this. So not really understanding the engineering marvel that is modern sewage and plumbing, right? I mean, the Victorians, in modern Britain, welcome the fact that they were able to do something with the sort of sewage water of, so this is a huge modern engineering marvel. And, of course, Litoet doesn't understand this and makes his own judgments about it. In addition, he in his jaunts to the city, he also encounters modern sports for the first time. Here he is at a boxing match, and the boxers are pummeling one another, and he shouts at them, "Stop this! Let's not fight over anything. We should make peace. Peace is always best." So again, not understanding modern sports, modern recreation, modern practices. And here's another one. This is him and his sidekick, Sase. I'll talk about him in the next slide, but basically him and his sidekick, both of them are country bumpkins, both of them are in the city. They go to a cinema for the first time, see a couple passionately kissing on screen. And Sase turns to Litoet and said, "What are they doing?" Basically, Litoet says they're pre-masticating rice and feeding it to one another. So basically, misunderstanding. Makes you realize that the concept of romantic love is a new one, as well as the practice of mouth-to-mouth French kissing, if you will. That there is a kind of to kind of give it a little bit of to historicize it a little bit. If I remember correctly from my own experiences with my own Vietnamese grandmother, she never kissed me per se, but she smelled me, right? So that was my experience growing up. So this kind of resonated for me, the idea of that they would be unfamiliar with mouth-to-mouth kissing. Okay, and so excuse me. And so this is actually the first cartoon that features Litoet and this sidekick, right? So sidekicks will become an interesting thing to discuss because, this sidekick was introduced spontaneously by Vietnamese readers. This was the first sent in. This was sent in by a reader in Saigon. And this is basically featuring Litoet and Sase. Sase is also a funny a name, a humorous name. Sase meaning the saggy commune chief. And so both of them are in the city. They see a scale. The sign behind the scale says, insert 1 sou to weigh, and they realize that they don't have enough money between the two of them. They don't have money, they only have 1 sou between the two of them. And so they decide that they were both going to weigh each other all at once and divide their weight in 2. Which obviously is not how it works, so this is actually the first instance in which we see this this sidekick as part of the cartoon's discourse, and readers are going to run with this. Over the years, readers will submit hundreds of cartoons featuring this duo, and as you can see, they kind of visually mimic Laurel and Hardy. So Laurel and Hardy, who was actually really popular at the time. The 1930s was the height of their popularity. So this was a kind of Vietnamese version of Laurel and Hardy. It's sort of yeah. So Vietnamese readers this really resonated with them, and especially the theme of country bumpkins misunderstanding modernity became a theme for the readers. That said, the Self-Reliant Literary Group, this is unfolding separate to the Self-Reliant Literary Group. And actually the Self-Reliant Literary Group, my reading of it is that they probably they were quite uncomfortable with this discourse of kind of country bumpkins, Dumb and Dumber, making fools of themselves in the city. So there were instances that, the Self-Reliant Literary Group tried to guide this discourse or, change, to inject, different conversations into the discourse. And we can see this through their own introduction of a new sidekick, right? So if the readers liked Sase, right, the saggy commune chief, as as Litoet's sidekick, the Self-Reliant Literary Group introduced their own sidekick, a good-natured and dapper character by the name of Baek, or it translates to 3 frogs. Baek, as you can see here, this is Baek, and this is the cover of These Days that feature him. So you can see that the group very prominently wanted to feature Baek as an alternative sidekick to Litoet. And Baek is, he's an urbanite, right? He's a prankster. He's a person who makes fun of those deserving to be picked on. He's a stylish young man. He wears a 3-piece suit. He often wears a fedora. He's basically the quintessential city slicker. And in many ways, you can kind of read into him as a kind of personification of the Self-Reliant Literary Group, himself. He's completely at ease in Hanoi. So this guy is in any photos of him. He's in public spaces, in urban public spaces. He's resourceful. He's clever. He would get out of scrapes with police. He would flirt with the ladies. Basically his kind of jovial urbanity made him an ideal foil to the country boorishness of Litoet. And so, in other words, he kind of exemplified the self-reliant literary groups himself. So basically what you see here is a kind of tension between what the group wanted to see and what the readers wanted to see. The readers wanted to congratulate themselves, by making fun of the country bumpkins in the city. They wanted to kind of congratulate themselves for their sophistication, right? Whereas the Self-Reliant Literary Group said, no, that's not what we want. We don't want you guys making fun of the traditions and the older generation. In all of the interactions between Litoet and his urban sidekick, they are talking about everything, right? Baek is really cosmopolitan. So he talks about, Italian brown shirts versus the Nazi black shirt, or sorry, it's the other way around, Nazi brown shirts and the Italian black shirts. And he talks about politics of Argentina and, everywhere around the world because he's urbane. Litoet, on the other hand, takes it all in, process it and understands it via his own way of thinking. And then he shares with Baek about his own life, and Baek understands his life as well. So what happens here between these two sidekicks is you see a kind of tension with the relationship. The group wanted the readers to be sympathetic to tradition, not to talk, not to condescend to it, not to dismiss it, but to kind of come to a kind of understanding of one another. Whereas the readers were very much into the idea of just making fun of the country bumpkins in the city. So, oops, excuse me. Excuse me, sorry, I've just lost track of here. So what's so important about this dialogue, right? What is so important about this tension between the sidekicks? Actually, what is revealing about studying this newspaper, about studying mores and these days, is that we get a rare glimpse into the active creation of civil society through the public sphere. And it's guided by the dreams and vision of a select group of urban intellectuals. This newspaper was so interactive, and because the readers, themselves made so many contributions to the paper, that we can see over the course of the history of the paper and over the 1930s, how the group and its reading public came to understand together what it meant to be modern. And so as I've sort of illustrated in our discussion of humor, the readers were not always willing to adopt the perspective that the group wanted them to. And it suggests that in many ways and in various aspects, the group's project was perhaps too avant-garde for its readership. The readers were not necessarily prepared to embrace the group's uncompromising, modernist vision or cosmopolitan vision. On the other hand, the group hoped to bring about a kind of independence of mind and a skepticism in its readers, but were actually not all that comfortable to let the readers create that vision for themselves. And actually, what I would say is ultimately, it was this frustration about the ambiguity and the flux of modern life that led some members of the group and many of the group's readers to later ally themselves with the Communist Party and the Communist Project and its demands to directly oversee the education of Vietnamese citizens and the nation building process, right? So there's no ambiguity in the communist path to statehood. The ambiguity in the group's path to statehood, I argued that a lot of their readers and even many of the group's own members are not wholly comfortable with. And so, communism did not allow for ambiguity or skepticism. Instead, it had a dictated outcome and a single truth for what it meant to be modern and Vietnamese. So do we have time for me to just talk a little bit about my contributions, or I could just end it here and just go straight to Q&A?
Well, if you have something quick, sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay, great. So just a couple of just very quickly about the contributions of this book to Southeast Asian studies, Vietnamese studies, and European imperialism and colonialism. So as I mentioned before, this is the first, most thorough, exhaustively sourced history of the Self-Reliant Literary Group, and the most systemic. And by doing so, I make two distinct contributions to Southeast Asian studies and Vietnamese studies, as well as the field of European imperialism. First, what the book does is it radically intervenes into the scholarship of colonial Vietnam. Nationalist histories depict the victory of Marxism and Leninism as a foregone conclusion. And that, in order to build a modern Vietnamese nation state, you have to have this Machiavellian, end of colonial struggle to get there. And by doing so, through this historiography, it reduces the importance of other revolutionary initiatives. But it also flattens, right, this incredible and this rich, incredible period of Vietnamese history of the 1930s. So, even though Western language scholarship of this period is critical of this communist narrative, in many ways, it recreates unwittingly a lot of these characterizations. So, what my work does is it actually, it says that the presence of strong nationalist movements like the Self-Reliant Literary Group necessarily shaped the way that the Communist Party positioned itself for mass support in the years leading up to the revolution, right? So in order to understand how the Communist Party comes to position itself for mass support in terms of, winning the populace over and mass mobilization, we need to understand what is happening in the 1930s at the time. So in a certain sense, we can't really understand the trajectory of 20th century Vietnamese history writ large without understanding these, non-communist nationalist movements like the Self-Reliant Literary Group. My second contribution to European colonialism and imperialism focus on the fact that the group's nationalist vision, it's a case study of nationalism in which anti-colonial struggle was largely absent, right? So a lot of the historiography of in European imperialism and empire, I mean, there's a starting to kind of, doubt this, but there's been a lot of studies about, how it all ends with the nation state, it all ends in decolonization and anti-colonial struggle leading to the formation of modern nation states. What this does is my book excavates alternative views of how to move forward in a future post-colonial world. I contextualize the group's intellectual project within a larger global milieu. And so by doing so, I argue that the group, by observing the world in which they live, the global world, as well as their immediate Vietnamese context, realize that they can only depend on themselves. Right. That's why, hence the Self-Reliant Literary Group, in the face of all this political, economic, social uncertainty. And so they devised themselves an open-ended nationalism that Vietnamese can start now, doesn't matter who's in power, follow the pattern. And at some point, if Vietnam is ready to claim autonomy, the the civil society institutions are already set. So those are my two sort of contributions to the scholarship. Thanks so much for listening. And I think I'll stop here and I'll start taking some questions.